Are you frustrated with the American school system and the way that it seems to just be built on an obedience model where it exchanges curiosity for compliance? Well, I was too. And through a grant from the Heterodox Academy, Zachary Cresswell and I created a curriculum based on understanding critical thinking. It's absolutely free and it's available at williamroosh.com/critical thinking. Hello and welcome to the next episode of Cylinder Radio. This is the first podcast I've done since early October. I've taken some time off to build my online educational platform to try and change the way schooling is done. And coming back with someone who's doing something really important in the educational space. I'm really excited to talk to him. Corey DeAngelis is an author, and he's the senior fellow at American Federation for Children. He's also a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institute. He's executive director at the Educational Freedom Institution, an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, a senior fellow at Reason Foundation, Forbes 30 under 30. He's a PhD in educational policy, and his big thing, and I'm so excited to talk to you, Corey, your big thing is about school choice. And this is something I've been a classroom teacher for 17, this is my 17th year doing it. And for most of my career, I've heard about this school choice and vouchers thing is like a terrible thing, and it's terrible for schools, it's terrible for children. And I've started to open up years ago. You and I had a conversation maybe like during COVID or something. And since then, I've been following what you're doing and talking about it with other people too. And it's like, oh, I was wrong. So welcome. Thank you. I'm really excited to have this conversation. I've been wanting to reach out to you for a while, but like I said, I haven't been recording much. But first of all, like, how did you get into this? Because you are like the go-to whenever someone's talking about like funding students and not schools and changing the way that funding is done. I always reference you and your work and send them your way. So how did you even get into this?
Yeah, it's interesting that we started talking about this during the COVID era because we've seen the school choice revolution really take the nation by storm. Since 2020, we've had 11 states pass universal school choice in just the past few years. So we can get into that later. But I really got into this as a researcher at the University of Arkansas, where I did my PhD in education policy. That's where I really got interested in the concept of school choice. I actually studied different programs, and my first evaluation was of the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program. It's a voucher program that started in Milwaukee in 1990. And my professor there, Patrick Wolf, and I had student level data over time. And we were able to track those students from the longitudinal evaluation of the study until they were about 30 years of age. And we were able to match them to students based on similar characteristics, whether they were being the same race, being the same income level, having the same background, like being in a single parent household or not. And we found that after controlling for all those observable differences, the students using the school choice initiative had a much lower likelihood of committing crime by the time they were about 30 years of age, all else equal. So that was a pretty groundbreaking study. And I really got interested in linking school choice to non-academic outcomes because people are choosing schools for a lot of different reasons. One could be because of academics, obviously, but also families are choosing schools based on safety. They want good citizenship education, character education. And as we've seen over the past couple of years now with kind of the teachers unions overplaying their hand in the public school system by keeping the schools closed for so long, families got to see a little bit of what was happening in so many classrooms to where they were disagreeing with the curriculum in the public schools. And so families could be choosing just schools that align with their values. And I think that's why we've seen this supercharged moment of education freedom sweeping the nation. So I was a researcher. I still do some studies from time to time. I think one of my most recent ones linked the COVID school closures to the union presence in that area. So the stronger teachers unions were correlated with a lower likelihood of reopening your schools in person. But even before that, even before my PhD, I actually benefited from school choice. I went to government-run schools or public schools all through K through 12. And in high school, however, I was able to go to something called a magnet school. You guys have magnet schools in California. I grew up in Texas, where I now live as well. And that was a great opportunity for me. And I think other families should have choices in education too, but it shouldn't be limited to schools that are run by the government. Magnet schools are great, but that shouldn't be the only option. You should be able to choose charter, private, home-based education options too, and the money should follow the student.
Yeah, I love that. My kids, they were in LAUSD, which is like I think one of the biggest districts in the country, not the biggest. They were still wearing masks and socially distanced at recess in May of 2022. And it was just like
Yes.
it was so bananas. And I was just kept talking. I was like that annoying parent that was just like asking them, like, where's the data for this? Like, why are you doing this? What's going on? And they just kept just saying, like, it's policy, it's the policy. So we moved them, and they're in like a Christian private school now that's like closer to our house. They have 4 recesses, which I would say is like awesome for my little high energy kids. But how did you, going back to you, like, were you interested in education your whole life? Like, why this specific area? Like, what
Mhm.
brought you to this? Was it because for me, it's always been like, I think a lot of the problems in society can be solved through education. It just seems like a simple play. Like
Yep.
a lot of the things are just like lack, too much ignorance, and just like getting people to be more aware, critical thinkers and stuff like that just seems to be a way to solve a whole bunch of problems. What got you into like the education space for your career specifically? Because you could be doing this kind of research and this kind of
Yep.
effort that you're doing in so
Mhm.
many different areas.
Right. And I will say real quickly that Los Angeles actually had a report on safely reopening schools. I'm sure you remember this, where they included a whole bunch of political demands that had nothing to do with safely reopening schools. They were calling for a wealth tax, police free schools. Of course, they wanted more money, but it really just let the mask slip. In that they got to show their true colors, and families were like, well, this doesn't really make a lot of sense. It took the nation by storm. We saw other unions doing similar things, but the most egregious cases were probably in Los Angeles,
It was pretty
Chicago, and a
bad.
couple other places. But yeah, as far as me being interested in education, I actually got into this from a libertarian perspective. So I see the school system as one of the most socialistic institutions we have today in the country, where the government is controlling the schools. And some people say, well, why do you call them government schools? They're actually public schools. But I think it's actually an important distinction, because they're
Yeah.
not like public parks, where if you live, if you just walk by a certain school, you can, your child can attend that school.
Right.
You can attend any school. They're not really public in any meaningful sense of the word. Some families have been fined or even sent to jail for sending their kids to for lying about their address to get
Yeah.
into better quote unquote public schools. So not really public in that sense of the word, but they are directly operated by the government, whether it strings from the federal government and control in that sense, or from the state and local governments as well. People have responded by saying, no, these are local schools that are controlled by the local community, but they're controlled by local governments. I mean, it's really a distinction without a difference. But
Yeah.
um, I think I also see schooling as an extension of parenting, whether we like it or not. We're outsourcing a portion of our parenting our child to some other actors, whether it's a private entity in a private school that we choose, or it's a government entity in the government school sector, and the kids are with them for the people that we're outsourcing parenting to for a very long time, 7 hours a day, 5 days a week, 180 days a year, for 13 years of their lives, if you just count the K through 12 portion of education. And that can have a huge effect on how that child is going to develop, the values that they're going to have. And if you have special interests controlling that system, those kids are going to grow up with values that are not aligned with their families. And it might not even be aligned with broader society at large, since it's a special interest. It could be a tyranny of the minority situation, not even a tyranny of the majority. And that can have profound impacts on other areas of, as a libertarian, I'm interested obviously in tax policy. I'm interested in
Mhm.
all types of policies, but I think the root of the problem that we have with so much government overreach in other areas of our lives is that you have people being indoctrinated in government run schools to like big government policy as the solution to all of our problems. And that's not to say that this is happening in every public school. It's not to say that all the teachers are like this either. There are great teachers in every sector. There are bad teachers in every sector. But I think when you have school choice, you have it more of a likelihood to hold institutions accountable if they are not doing things that parents actually like. And we saw during the COVID era, that when parents weren't happy with what was happening, when they weren't happy with the type of curriculum in the public school classrooms, when they went to the school board, in some places their mics were cut off, and we even had a national the National School Boards Association sent a letter to the Department of Justice implying that these parents protesting at school board meetings should be investigated for domestic terrorism.
Yeah, I remember that.
So when you don't have real agency, when you don't have real power in the relationship between the consumer, the family, and their kids, and the institution, which happens to be the public schools, they're going to view you as a nuisance rather than a customer, and they're not going to listen to you. But if you have school choice, if the funding could follow the child, if you can say, hey, if you don't listen to me, if you do cut off my mic, if you try to label me as an evil person, I'm going to vote with my feet. And in that sense, the public school have a stronger incentive to listen, and you might not even have to switch schools in that case if they start doing what you want, or if they're more aligned with your values, or if they start teaching more of the basics as opposed to politically divisive topics.
Yeah, it's interesting you say like the socialistic element of it. There's a lot of layers of where I see that, where it's like the lack of incentive. Something that I say all the time. I was at like a gathering of like a bunch of entrepreneurs, and I'm a school teacher, so I was saying, it's kind of odd because the best teacher in the building gets paid the same as the worst teacher. And it's all based on like, how many credits do you get in like, maybe in additional higher education, or how long you've been there, but not how good of a quality of a teacher are you? Like, it's a very strange thing. And I was trying to explain like the way that works to people who are in like, the private sector, like entrepreneur types who are just like, you hustle and then you make your money, and it's like, doesn't work like that. So of course it's going to devolve in the same way that a socialist kind of like communist concept of like a country would, which is like taking away that incentives. But then also it's like the controlling entity does have a lot of control. So even if you are good hearted, I think a lot of teachers get into this for the right reasons. It's just, you're still within this system that is so limiting, and it drives that like that incentive for you to be great out of you. It's just really hard. I mean, I've seen that in a bunch of different ways. But you bring up parenting, and when we look at like the voucher programs, parents who really fight to get their kid into a better school and they end up doing better. I wonder how we can control for this, because I've taught in like the worst neighborhoods of LA and some of the best. And when it's parent teacher conference night, and I'm at like one of these like schools like in the hood, it's a lonely night for me. I'm just kind of sitting there waiting to like meet these parents and stuff. They don't show up. And then at like a wealthy private school where I've taught at as well, it's like line out the door, and I'm just like, your kid's great. Your kid's great. So I wonder how much of this issue is just, if you have parents that are involved, you have parents. I mean, even when I was teaching in like really bad neighborhoods, the parents who were involved and did come to parent teacher conference night and were on their kids ended up being okay. Like,
Right.
I'm with you. Parent involvement is so important. And I talked to Matt Boudreau from the Apogee schools. He was on here just talking about how it's crucial part of what they do is like, parent involvement. How do you deal with that kind of pushback? Because the indifferent parents, they're not going to be pushing for their kids. Their parents who are just like, hey, you raise my kid, they're not the ones who are going to be helping their kid anyway. You need some sort of like go-getter parent that's looking and says, I don't have options, give me options. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I would argue the traditional system, the status quo, feeds into this over reliance of outsourcing your duties as a parent to the government. So with school choice, however, on the other hand, this automatically makes the parents more involved. You have to choose. You have to go shop around for the school. So just by the very nature of allowing families to choose, you'll actually increase parental involvement relative to the status quo. Whereas if you don't have the money to be able to afford to pay for private school tuition and fees, what's your incentive to go look up other options? It kind of might just make you depressed if you know you can't afford to if you can't afford to live in the fanciest neighborhoods to be assigned to the better public schools, or if you can't afford to pay twice, one through taxes and then again through out of your pocket through tuition and fees. However, if you had a policy like we're seeing in a lot of states passing right now, where the money can follow the child, now you have $10,000 per student per year. You might say, hey, I might want to start looking into this now because I now have opportunities. And there's actually a study on this from 2018 by, I believe it was Cornell researchers, where they looked at online search behavior in areas over time. And as states or localities passed school choice programs and expanded them, the search activities for these alternative providers started to skyrocket as well. So that just gives some additional evidence that when you pass school choice, you're going to increase parental involvement by its very nature. And you had asked, how do you control for this parental involvement when we're doing studies? I think might have been the question. Is we have some lottery-based studies. So in charter schools, probably in California, you've probably noticed that some of them have wait lists, and then it goes to lotteries to determine who gets in and who does not. Well, if you have access to the lottery data, it's like a controlled experiment, like a medical trial, where you can compare the winners of the lottery who get to go to the charter school or the private school through the voucher program. You can compare them to the same motivated group of parents who wanted to get in but couldn't and had to go back to the traditional system, and you can compare the outcomes. And there have been quite a number of studies, I believe about 17 or 18, looking at voucher programs alone using lottery-based methods and connecting the outcome to academic outcomes. A majority of those finding statistically significant positive effects for some or all students when you're comparing the lottery winners to the losers. That's the highest quality gold standard experiments we have. But we also do have some studies looking at things like satisfaction, reports of safety, and those outcomes tend to be better than the testing outcomes. And I think it's because school quality is multidimensional, something I pointed out earlier. Parents are choosing based on academics, yes, but they're also choosing based on a whole bunch of other things. And sometimes Maslow's hierarchy makes its way into the equation, and at the bare minimum, you want a safe place for your kid to go each day. The academics come later. And so we see a lot more positive effects when it comes to things like safety. And then one other thing is, you mentioned that the traditional public school system is kind of insulated from competition. And that is also how I got into this as well. I did my bachelor's and master's in economics. And the biggest problem, monopoly power, that I see in the country today is held by the traditional school system, where, I mean, just imagine if in order to go to start shopping at another grocery store or a restaurant, you had to get up and move houses every time you wanted to switch grocery stores. That would make zero sense. That has a huge transaction cost to moving a house. And it gives the provider that you are assigned to substantial monopoly power. The grocery stores would probably have empty shelves. The food would probably be expired. And with the public schools, you see the same kind of problem. If you want to go somewhere else, you got to move to a better neighborhood. It might be, even if it wasn't a super expensive house that had a better public school, you still have to get up and move. That is a huge pain to have to switch doing it that way. And then to pay out of pocket while you're still paying for the public school and you're not using it, that gives the public school substantial monopoly power at the same time. So, and then as far as, you mentioned teachers as well in the system. I think that school choice would benefit the teachers too. We actually have about 5 studies on this. I wrote about this in a blog at the Washington Examiner called "School Choice Benefits Teachers Too." Back in 2018 or 2019, I summarized a handful of studies on this, all finding positive, statistically significant effects of private and charter school competition on teacher salaries in the public schools. And I think that's because it gives their employer, the district, an incentive to start funneling that money into the classroom towards the teacher, as opposed towards being towards an administrative bloat. And during the pandemic, since that's come up a couple of times, the Washington Post actually had a good article. And it outlined there was one. In New Jersey, there was a public school teacher. They highlighted her story. She was in the system for decades. She left during the pandemic to start a micro school. And for listeners, if you're not familiar with those, it's 5 to 10 children basically getting together in a household. A teacher or a guide can run the school. It's a miniature school, basically. And they can have a fraction of the class size, 5 to 10 students instead of 30 or 40. And they highlighted that this New Jersey public school teacher, where they spend, I want to say like $30,000, $40,000 per student per year in the public school system in New Jersey. She was making about the same amount of money for a fraction of the class size, having more autonomy and not having to deal with all the red tape in the public school system, and being in a safer environment at the same time. That's a huge win for teachers. The article didn't take the next step and say, well, just imagine if we had education savings accounts that the money followed the child, and then teachers could make a whole bunch more money than they were in a system where people have to actually pay out of pocket. If the money followed the child, more of that money can get directly from the family to the teacher. You cut out all the middlemen, you cut out a lot of the fixed costs associated with the school buildings, and that could be a huge win for teachers too. And so much, in fact, that in some places like in Denver, you had their superintendent during the pandemic sending out emails about these pandemic pods, they were calling them. When schools were closed, families were banding together, basically creating micro schools, and they were calling them pandemic pods. And they said, well, this is going to lead to segregation. This is going to cause all these problems. They were throwing every buzzword at the wall to see what would stick. And the Denver public school superintendent also complained or warned that public school teachers shouldn't take this offer to go work in the private sector, because they knew that this was competing for their talent, and they wanted to keep the public school teachers in the current system. When in fact, places like in Arizona, where they've had education savings accounts for a long time, and for listeners, education savings accounts is kind of like a scholarship or voucher, where the money that would have followed you to the public school, you can still take it there if you want. But if not, the funding actually goes into a savings account directed by the parent, much like a health savings account, which you could only use for health expenditures. But for education, you can only use it for education expenditures. And you could use it for these micro schools to pay the teacher basically directly, not have to pay for a lot of the other materials that go into the public school system, meaning teachers could actually make more. But in Arizona, they've been doing this for a long time, and they've done it for such a long time. I think they've had ESAs since 2012, I want to say. It was the first state to pass the education savings account model of school choice. And they've had Prenda micro schools blossoming out there. It's their main provider of micro schools out there. And they've become such a growing industry that's popular with teachers and students, that the teachers union, which is not the same thing as representing the interests of the teachers themselves, the union, the NEA, the National Education Association, the biggest teachers union in the country, they actually put out an opposition research sheet on Prenda micro schools and their founder, Kelly Smith. And the Wall Street Journal editorial board actually got a hold of that opposition research sheet, because they ended up sending it to the wrong email. And one of our allies actually got it to the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, and they wrote about it. And the headline was "The Teachers Union's Tiny Little Enemy." It had a picture of an elephant afraid of an ant, but it really just goes to show you that the market for education could look a lot different than it does today. And I think that's making the status quo, not the teachers in the system, but the leaders like Randy Weingarten, who make over $500,000 a year, way too much for not doing the actual work. And for actually, when it comes to Randy Weingarten, making the teachers on the ground look bad by just tweeting nonsense every single day. She actually turns off her replies on all of her tweets. I don't know if you're on X that much, Will, but she closes her replies like she closed the schools. She lobbied the CDC to make it more difficult to reopen schools in person. And they were actually threatening so-called safety strikes whenever districts were talking about reopening the schools as well. So, but she's just so political and just rails against conservatives 24/7. And look, there's a lot of liberals and conservatives that teach in the public school system, and she should represent all of their interests and all of their backgrounds and all of their political affiliations, not just one side of the aisle.
Yeah, and you can look up. Thank you. There's a lot there. You answered my question about the parents too. Thank you. Like the how you measure for that. But yeah, I've had on, because this is like a viewpoint diversity podcast. So I've reached out to the NEA in so many different ways to bring someone on my podcast. I've had, and they're just no. You're probably like public enemy number one to them, like, because
yeah, I mean, Randy Weingarten refused to go on Dr. Phil. I went on Dr. Phil a couple of years ago, and I think Dr. Phil's actually come around on the topic. He was on Joe Rogan talking
Yeah.
about how the school closures were ridiculous and it never should have happened. But I was telling him about this a couple of years ago on his show. And Randy Weingarten, her team asked if I was going to be on, and when they found out I was going to be on, apparently, from what I've heard, they said that they weren't going to do it. So
Yeah, you know what, Corey, that's
she
how I
won't
got.
debate.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's how I got into this stuff. I'm like categorized with those people that are like, anti woke. But really, the way I fell into that is who will talk to me and who won't. And the people who won't talk, you look at like the architects of like whatever that like critical social justice stuff, Ibram Kendi and like that, his whole like lot, like they don't talk, they don't debate. Coleman Hughes was like, let's have a conversation. We'll donate the money to the United Negro College Fund. Let's do it. And he's just like, no.
Not happening.
So every time that there's two different sides on an issue and they won't talk about it, I'm like, well, then you're probably on the wrong side then, because you can't even defend it. Like, what are they so scared of? That just seems to be how I keep falling into like the kind of places that I am in this whole culture war. You brought up the concept of responsibility, like the indifferent parents it's like chicken or the egg to some degree, but they're indifferent probably because they can be. Like if you have this opportunity to just send your kids, you don't have to think about it or anything like that.
Yep.
Then you will, like, what you take the path of least resistance. But this concept of like, if you give them these resources, then it will elicit some sort of responsibility of what do I do with these resources. That is a very empowering message that you have for the people who are pushing probably against what you're saying, which is like, what about these poor families who don't have a lot of resources, who, are working 2 jobs, and, the single mom who's working at a diner and delivering Amazon packages and stuff like that, who's just so busy. It's like, well, I'm giving her more resources and more autonomy over her life and the lives of her children. Like, you don't think she can handle that? Like, it kind of flips it back to this, like, like the low bar, like the what is it, the soft bigotry of low expectations or whatever.
Yeah, don't throw stones if you live in a glass house. The traditional system is rife with inequality, whereas the lowest income families in society are assigned to the worst government schools.
The worst schools, right?
They're in the worst position to be able to pay out of pocket for private school tuition and fees and other options. So giving the families the money, which is interesting too, because a lot of the same people railing against school choice for K through 12, they support money going to families and allowing them to choose for pre-K.
Yeah.
They support it for college. They support
all kinds
it for
of social safety nets,
Medicaid
right?
vouchers, everything else. You can Section 8 housing vouchers.
Right.
Vouchers
Food
are all
stamps
fine.
And all that kind of stuff.
Food, everything. Only when it comes to K through 12 is it a problem. And that's because this is all about power dynamics. It has nothing to do with logic. If you're being consistent, you would support it when it comes to K through 12 as well, if you supported it for higher ed, pre-K, and everything else. It just so happens that the Democratic Party is an arm of the teachers' unions of this point. They're a wholly owned subsidiary of the teachers union. If you look at Randy Weingarten's donations, 99.9% of them went to from the American Federation of Teachers, went to Democrats in the most recent election cycles. So this is all about political power.
Yeah, people can look that up. Yeah, how does like the NEA donate? How much do they donate and to whom? It's all like public record. You can see that they're clearly donating to the Democratic Party, and it's like become this political thing. Sandy Darity, who's like, I think he's of the left. He's like an economist, but he's like for pro reparations guy. And I heard him have a conversation with Glenn Loury one time. He was talking about this concept of baby bonds, that if you're born in a poor community, that you get money from the government and it goes in like a trust basically, and then when you're 18 you can use that for something to like build a life. And he's like, a lot of people in these poor communities, they don't want to take a financial literacy class because like learn how to deal with money. I don't have money. But if you give them this, and that was his argument, it sounds very similar. And I think that like give people a chance, give them resources, and let them learn how to make the best decisions for their kids. It's so strange to me that dissonance between what they support in all of these areas, but not this one. It's very interesting.
Right. And conservatives can remain logically consistent by not supporting government expansion into other areas, but supporting the funding following the child for K through 12, because this is still a taxpayer savings relative to what is being spent in the public schools. If you look at the National Center for Education Statistics, the average amount we spend in the public schools, according to 2021 data, I want to say, it's probably higher now, was $19,999 per student per year in the public schools. It's obviously higher in some states and localities and lower in others. That's just an average. But the average private school tuition and fees is only about $12,000 or $13,000 a year if you look at the data from Private School Review. And so let's say you gave families, it's typically you give families a fraction of what would have been spent in the public school. So let's say it's 10,000. Well, then that's 10,000 that can either go to taxpayer savings or back to the public school to help them kind of adjust with the changes in their student population. And that's typically how it works out. So it saves taxpayer money, gives families additional choices, but also can have some of the funding go back to the public schools to help them adjust. And in fact, the public schools end up with a higher per student revenue and expenditure, because if you're losing the full student, but you're getting to keep, let's say, $1,000 per student, your spending is going to go up in the public schools if you're looking on a per student basis. But yeah, so like the main point I was trying to bring up is that conservatives can still be logically consistent by supporting K-12 funding going directly to families while being hesitant about pre-K programs, for example.
Yeah, this is where it's so strange to me, because I'm trying to follow the thread of thinking of people who are against, and I've been trying to get people who are against this on my podcast, but again, they don't come on. Like, if you're trying to get more resources into poor families who can't afford to send their kids to better schools, like it's so interesting that's something that they would be against. It just doesn't,
well, because that's all virtue signaling. That's not
Yeah.
what they truly believe. The virtue signal is that, oh, we're here just to help the least advantaged. That's not what that's not their point. The point is to maintain the power structure as it is today when it comes to the government school monopoly. It's usually people who think that they're going to lose their jobs. That has never happened anywhere. And when it comes to the public, and also this could mean less funding. If less funding is going towards the teachers unions, that means less money making its way back to the Democratic campaign coffers. So it's more of a political partisan thing than anything else. And if you look at the main argument they make, however, when you go into state capitals and they're trying to lobby to legislatures as to why they should vote against school choice, the number one argument is they'll say that this is going to destroy or dismantle our fantastic public schools. Well, if they're so fantastic, why would giving families a choice destroy them? And you're really just kind of telling on yourself. If you don't believe that families are going to choose your product, you're not really confident in the services that you're providing. But that doesn't happen anywhere. You can't point to any state that the public school system has been destroyed. A majority of states have some form of private school choice. The vast majority, I believe about 47 or 48 states, have public charter school laws on the books, and that hasn't destroyed the public school system. In fact, 29 studies exist on this topic, and I can share it with your listeners later, but 26 of those 29 studies find positive effects of private school choice competition on the outcomes in the public schools. And also, if you want to look at a peer-reviewed meta-analysis, the latest one is from 2022 by a UT Austin professor by the last name of Jabbar, Jabbar. And in the journal called Educational Policy, which I wouldn't say is a conservative journal, I'd probably say it's more of a far left-leaning journal, they published this result, finding that if you pool all of these studies together, the overall meta-analytic average effect size is a positive effect resulting from private and charter school competition on the outcomes in the public schools. So school choice is a rising tide that lifts all boats. Competition works in every other industry. It works in higher ed and pre-K. It works in K through 12 as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason why, but the thinking of the way schools work is just different than other sectors of society, and I don't understand. To get access to the money, you probably have to have some sort of accreditation, right? Like, you can't just be like, have a shed in your backyard, be like, this is a school now. Does that give more power back to the government? Like, I don't know much about getting accredited. Like, is that going to be back into giving power to the government to say, like, you're not accredited? I've taught at charter schools before out here, and good ones and bad ones. It's not that hard to start one. And people say, like, well, you send your kid to a charter school, it might be a really terrible one. Like, yeah, but you send your kid to a public school. Like, public schools are failing. You can look at, like, Baltimore, like 0 graduates are at reading level.
Yeah,
like,
that's right.
Yeah, so yes, it's a risk with a charter school, but if you don't like it, then you can leave. That's the whole point that you're trying to make, right?
Exactly. Underperforming private schools shut down. Underperforming
Yeah.
government schools get more money. They say, oh, we're failing because we don't have enough
Right,
money, even though
right,
we're
right,
spending
right.
$20,000 a kid. Or in New York City, where they're spending $40,000 a kid, they have schools with 0% proficiency. But what do? They do. They go and say, oh, we need 60,000 a kid.
Yeah.
Like, that's throwing more money at the problem's not going to solve it. You need to fix it from the bottom up through allowing families to vote with their feet. That's the
Yeah.
only true form of accountability, is from the bottom up, not from the top down. That top down accountability is nothing more than red tape and regulation. True accountability in any industry is being able to say, hey, if I don't like this, I need to be able to choose among providers that are actually going to meet my need, because anything else is just a form of box checking that might not actually lead to better outcomes for kids. And I like how you pointed out that you do have failing schools in the public school system, and the regulations haven't led to those magically better outcomes in that system. So the state laws differ on school choice. Some of them require different varying levels of so-called government accountability, but I think the best laws are the ones that have the fewest strings attached as possible. I think when it comes to education savings accounts, the only reasonable regulation is to make sure that families are spending the money on education. You
Yeah.
can't go buy a big screen TV. And although they have big screen TVs in the public school too, that they
Ew.
spend taxpayer dollars on. But
Smart boards.
to get these things passed, to make them politically feasible, you have to make sure there's some guardrails. And so in Arizona, for example, they have annual audits to make sure that there isn't fraudulent spending. If there is fraudulent spending found, then you're going to get held
Yeah.
accountable for that. And what happens when there's fraudulent spending in the public school system? Not really that much. You hear stories of millions of dollars of fraud and abuse in the public school system. They don't abolish all public schools, because that might happen a certain percentage of the time. And opponents of school choice shouldn't use this argument to abolish school choice for every family just because it might happen 0.1% of the time. When it does happen, though, there should be accountability metrics. But when it comes to the government determining what type of curriculum is best or what type of school is best for your kid, I don't think that is a necessary or a proper role of government when it comes to choosing educational path for their kids. It should be really loosely defined. And I've never seen a school choice program where there has been the government dictating what the curriculum ought to be. I've never seen, for example, a school choice program over several decades of school choice program in the majority of states in the U.S. They've never said you have to teach CRT, for example, in order to get the funding. I think that would be ridiculous. I think there would be immense pushback for any of that happening. But this does get to an argument, Will, for that could come from the right, or more of like a libertarian faction. As a libertarian, I've heard this argument lots of times, that with government shekels could come government shackles. And so if we pass school choice, this is going to replicate the problems of the public schools and the private schools, and the government's going to control everything. And the same people have said that they've actually made the argument that school choice is somehow a Democrat plot to control all of the private schools. If that's true, why do all the Democrats vote against it? And then two, Randy Weingarten's made the same argument that the private schools could get captured by the public school, the government, if you allow for school choice. Do you think Randy Weingarten's some anti-government libertarian? No, she's a big government socialist trying to keep her gravy train going.
Yeah.
And so if you're on Randy Weingarten's side and not my side, you're probably on the wrong side if you're an education freedom fighter. But I really want to point out that school choice could actually reduce the likelihood of regulation in at least three ways from the government in the future. Because let's face it, the government can and has regulated private and home education without school choice. If they wanted to pass a law to outlaw certain forms of private education, they could probably do so if they really wanted to. And they have. In Oregon in 1922, there was a law passed to outlaw private education altogether in Oregon in 1922. It was actually overturned, thankfully, in 1925, 3 years later, by the Supreme Court in a case called Pierce versus Society of Sisters, where the court famously ruled that the child is not the mere creature of the state. But the reason I bring that up is it wasn't a school choice program that led to that overreach. It was authoritarians who wanted to control the minds of other people's children. And in New York today, they have the worst homeschooling laws on the books when it comes to overreach from the government. Same thing with Rhode Island and Massachusetts. And if you go to the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, their website has a map of all the state homeschool laws. The states like New York, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island have the worst rankings there, but they also have no private school choice programs. And if you look on the other end of the spectrum, places like Oklahoma and Iowa, they have universal school choice where every family is eligible. They have full-throated private school choice, and they have some of the best homeschooling laws on the books, according to the HSLDA website. So states that have more education freedom when it comes to school choice also tend to have more education freedom when it comes to raising your kids as you see fit when it comes to homeschooling. And so with school choice mechanisms like education savings accounts, you can reduce the likelihood of government overreach in at least three ways. One, well, if you have fewer kids being indoctrinated in government schools to see government as the answer to everybody's problems, you're going to have fewer people voting for politicians who want to regulate homeschooling and private education in the future, just by having families send their kids to schools that are aligned with their values, which are going to tend to be more free market than the special interests who control the one-size-fits-all system that we call the public school system in America. Two, politics is all about organized interests, fighting for what they want. We see this with the unions, but we could see this with parents in the future, and we kind of are when it comes to elections over the past few years. Politicians who support school choice have been winning, in particular in Texas. This just happened. And on Super Tuesday, 13 of the incumbents who voted against school choice that were targeted by my organization, the American Federation for Children, AFC Victory Fund, either 10 of those 13 either lost their seats outright or they were forced into runoffs. And this is the hardest thing to do in politics, to unseat a sitting legislator. Incumbents usually win 95% of the time. We won or advanced to runoffs in 77% of the races that we targeted when it came to incumbents who voted against school choice. So we've kind of inverted the trend in some places because school choice is very popular among primary voters in particular. But if you have more people benefiting from school choice, leading to more people benefiting from private and home education, you have a broader coalition, a bigger tent to fight against government overreach in the future. And so if you have more people banding together and locking arms, you're going to reduce the likelihood that government's going to be able to tell you what to do in the future. And then three, the concept becomes more mainstream when more people are using it. So the rest of society should be less likely to see private and home education as some icky thing that only a few people are doing. They should be less likely to call to regulate it if that's the case. And so making it more mainstream, and this has been a benefit of the COVID school closures too, in that people have become a lot more favorable towards homeschooling overall. If you look at polling from Morning Consult, I believe it was, every single month they found people were much more favorable of homeschooling after the school closures began. And if people are more favorable to the idea, and we've seen people kind of switching to homeschooling as well. The Census Bureau indicated that there was a doubling of homeschooling relative to pre-pandemic levels. And that should lead to less regulation, not more.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I'm getting into it. So just like, oh, excuse me. Just like getting, so if I hear this correctly, it would be like when these policies get instituted, then if it's 19,000 per student ish, okay, some of that goes back to the parents. And we say like, you get money from the government, then you're going to get shackles from it. Yeah, but it's also getting
and it's all voluntary.
You've already paid.
Yes, and it's all voluntary. No school choice program has ever forced the people to take. You can make that cost benefit decision for yourself.
Yeah. So, but like there is going to be still some resources going to the public schools, and it makes sense economically that there's going to be less kids. I was teaching public school. I had 48 kids per class, just me, 48. And this was in the hood. Like these were kids who didn't have a lot of guardrails in their life. And it was almost impossible for me to do my job. So now you're going to have fewer students because there's more choice. There are going to be those parents that are going to pull their kids out, so there's going to be less students in these schools, but more resources per student. So like, I
Yep.
mean, so even that idea, it would be better for the kids who do have those indifferent parents, the kids who are just basically raising themselves as latchkey kids, like they're going to have better resources because there'll be just fewer students in these buildings. I mean, that seems to make sense. Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah, it's a higher per student revenues and
Yeah.
expenditures. You have smaller class sizes that result for the teachers. And then you have more employment opportunities for the teachers as well, because in the current system, economists like to call a monopoly in the labor market a monopsony. And so if you don't have a lot of choices when you're a teacher, you basically 90% of the market is the government school system. So you basically have to take what you get in the traditional system, and you either like it or you don't. And if you don't, there are some private options to choose from. But also, if your employer is no longer a monopoly, they'll start to have stronger incentives to allocate those resources towards the teachers that are the most important educational resource in that building, as opposed towards administrators. And so um, I think that's why, yeah, it should be a win for the teachers. At the same time, smaller class sizes, more autonomy, and then a stronger kind of they'll have more power in the employment decisions when it comes to seeking out alternatives. If there's more private providers, then look, the jobs for teachers aren't going to go away, even if tons of students, and this doesn't really happen. It's not a mass exodus that occurs when school choice passes. It's usually about a couple percentage points of the population
Mhm.
take advantage of the programs.
Yeah.
But let's say 50% of people left. That's hasn't been shown to happen, but let's say it did. Well, then those students are going somewhere. They're going to need teachers in some sector. So and you might say, oh, well, private schools on average pay less in salaries. That could be the case on average. But if you start to have the money following the child, the private schools could start to pay the teachers more as well. So if you had a mass movement of 50% of the kids going to the private sector and having the money follow them, well, then the private schools could probably pay higher levels as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, and you weigh it out because I've taught in private schools that are like really the kids say like thank you at the end of class and stuff like that. It's like even if you get paid less, it's like it's a better job
Yeah.
still. So you weigh that out with any kind of job. I love the idea of supporting teachers and that good teachers and bad teachers should get out of the profession. There's a lot of teachers that just stay in this profession because it's like a cushy job, but like when I didn't like the school I was at and it just didn't like meet my needs, I couldn't teach the way I wanted to. I went out like a free agent. And I went out and I hustled to try and get into a place that I love. And I found a school that I loved. And then I've been here for 10 years. And now I'm like going to go off and do homeschooling thing because I want to try and like make a pathway for good teachers that like you can make a real living. Like you can do this. You just have to scale what you're doing. And that's what I'm trying to do with my homeschool, like educational platform is like from micro schools and stuff like that is if I'm good at my job, which I believe I am, I've been doing it for a while and I have like, a good track record, then I should be able to do it for as many students as possible. And there's a scale element to homeschooling. Does that like if it's like online educational platforms and stuff like that too, then you can get access to government. I know there's homeschool programs that you can use these savings accounts for as well. And then you
That's
have a
even the
micro
case
school and
in
something. It'd be great.
California. I think
Yeah.
I think in California, if you're homeschooling but you're signed up through a virtual charter school, I believe
Mhm.
the families can get like $3,000, up to $3,000 per student per year. It might be higher now. I haven't checked in a while, but in California, a lot of people don't know about this because most people think, oh, California doesn't have any form of
Yeah.
school choice because it's not one of the states you would expect them to have anything other than charter schools, but they do have some form of homeschool choice in that up to $3,000 a year can follow the student, but you do have to be signed up with with a virtual charter school. So it's a little bit, you
Yeah.
know, different. There might be more regulations than you'd like, but it's better than nothing.
Um, so because this is an educational, I'm sorry, viewpoint diversity educational podcast, what would you say is like the best like steel man argument you can come up with for why people are against what you're doing? It's so hard because it makes a lot of sense. That's why I wanted to bring you on here. I'm like the stuff that you're saying, and the more I dive into this, the more it just makes sense to make the American education system better. Like it just makes sense to me. So what's like the best argument against what you're doing?
They don't have any good arguments. I mean, I already went over the one that they make
Right.
all the time. Their only argument is basically it's going to defund the public schools, to which I respond, this isn't defund public schools. If anything, public schools defund families. The school choice initiatives just return the money to the hands of the rightful owners, or at least the intended beneficiaries of that funding, the families and their kids. Education funding is supposed to be meant for educating children, not for propping up and protecting a particular institution. You would never say that allowing families to choose their grocery store defunded Walmart, because you know that your money doesn't belong to Walmart. It belongs to the family. And if you want to take it to Walmart, then fine. But if you want to take it to Safeway or another provider, that's your choice. It doesn't belong to either of those institutions. Similarly, the money meant for educating your child doesn't belong to the public schools or the private schools. It's meant for your kid, and you should be able to determine whether it goes to the public or private school. And so, you'd never say that Pell Grants defunded community colleges just because you could use Pell Grants at private or even public state universities. I mean, no one would make that argument. It doesn't make any sense, because we see that funding as belonging to the student that is the one that's meant to benefit from that higher education funding. With pre-K, you'd never say that choosing a religious pre-K provider stole money from the other one down the street that wasn't religious. I mean, it just wouldn't make sense to think about these things this way. Yet people have become so brainwashed in the current system to believe that that money's meant for the buildings and not the kids, that they actually start to buy this garbage argument that they repeat over and over again. But that's the main one. And you really know that the other side is losing and that you're winning when they resort to the pathetic attempt, the smear campaign, when they try to say that, oh, if you support school choice, you're racist. Argue with that one.
in doubt.
And that's not an argument. And they'll try to twist something in there. They'll say, oh, they'll say there's a racist history of school choice. Well, one, that's a genetic fallacy. If you learned something in your public school, you might have understood that just because something might have been bad a long time ago doesn't mean that people have the same intentions for the policy today. But then two, they get the history wrong. And in fact, Phil Magnus he actually wrote about this in the Wall Street Journal with a great article. The title was School Choice's Anti-Racist History, where he points out that in fact, the Virginia Education Association, their teachers union out there, actually locked arms with staunch segregationists to oppose school vouchers in the 1950s, because they knew that giving families from less advantaged backgrounds more opportunities would probably lead to racial integration. So they actually were on the opposite side. They're on the wrong side of history when it came to school choice. And if you look at the studies today, EdChoice has compiled these studies in their 1, 2, 3s of school choice. They look at the effects of private school vouchers on racial integration and find that the vast majority of these studies, I believe it's about 7 out of 8 or something. It's not a ton of studies, but out of the evidence that we have, the majority of them find that school choice leads to racial integration because the public school system is already so segregated as it is.
Right, because neighborhoods are segregated. I mean, like here in LA, like I mean, the school that I taught at before I was at where I'm at now, it was 0% white. So it was segregated in that way. But like the history of like the Rosenwald schools, you know, like those schools, like during segregation, you know, the black community was like, all right, well, we can't go to these schools, so we're going to make our own schools. We're going to make them great, and we're going to make them in the community. You know, I had Ian Rowe on the podcast, who's opened a bunch of great charter schools and stuff like that to help like in like black neighborhoods to help the black community and stuff. So that like,
yeah, he's running charter schools in New York City.
Yeah,
he's great.
Yeah, he's awesome. Like, so it seems like it's a lot of ignorance, and I hate to do that, but I'm with you. Like, it has to be like ignorance. So how do we educate? Like, that's why I wanted to have you on here. I really appreciate you being on here, and I'm gonna try to get this out to as many people who care about education as possible. But how do people get informed about the stuff that you're talking about? How do people keep up to date with everything you're doing? Because I don't know many people in this space. I know you, so I just direct people your way. So where can people see what you're up to, and how can they kind of learn more about this? Because I think I'm with you. I think it's ignorance. I think it's just like the way things have always been done. It's the thing that feels comfortable. I went through public school and I'm okay. So blah 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 blah, like that kind of thing. Just like too much change is just scary. Ironically, to the progressives, but like too much change is too scary. So you have to kind of ease them in and give them some information because they're just ignorant about what's actually going on, the stuff you talked about today. So how can people follow up with like this whole movement and everything like that? Let's just like,
well, it's no longer it's not going to be scary very much longer, especially because of all of the success that we've been having in red states in particular. Hopefully it comes to blue states pretty soon. But as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, 11 states now have gone all in on school choice, passing Milton Friedman's vision of having every family eligible, regardless of income, background, or zip codes. That's more than 1 in every 5 states now have access to universal school choice. That's over 20% of states.
Cool.
And that's happened in the past 3 years alone. So that's a lot of movement in a very short amount of time. But at the same time, we've been moving the needle on school choice incrementally for decades. We have a ton of evidence showing that this does not harm the public schools, and it's actually helped them up their game in response to competition. This is a win-win solution. It's a win for families who get more choices, obviously, but it's also a win for the public school students who remain in those situations for whatever reason, whether it's the best fit for them or whatever that reason might be. And we're having more victories coming this year as well. We declared 2023 the year of school choice because we had 8 states pass these universal programs last year. In 2024, I'm listening today to a hearing in Louisiana. I think they're going to pass universal school choice. Their only impediment before was their governor, John Bell Edwards. He would veto school choice every chance he would get. The legislature had the votes. The governor didn't sign the bills. Now they have Jeff Landry as governor. He supports school choice. He's actually backing the bills that are moving through the legislature right now. So they're going to pass. He's going to sign them. Louisiana is going to be another one of the states to add to the list. Tennessee's Governor Bill Lee is pushing for universal school choice this year as well. We had a win in Wyoming that just passed. They got their state's first education savings account program. So that's been huge. And the momentum's only going to continue moving. In Texas, we just had successful elections. And we think we're going to have universal school choice from the count of our votes. And based on how the elections have went, we think we're going to have universal school choice in Texas too next year. And that's just to list a couple of them. But if you want to follow my work and keep up with all these updates, because I'm almost getting tired of winning. We're winning so much on the school choice front. It's a lot of updates. It's a lot of updates. But I post them on Twitter, now X, all the time. You can follow me at DeAngelis Corey, DeAngelisCorey, just my last name and then my first name, at DeAngelis Corey. But also, if you want to contribute to our work, we have a new political arm called AFC Victory Fund, where we engage in the electoral process to hold politicians accountable and support those who support school choice. It's AFCVF.com. And that stands for AFC Victory Fund, AFCVF.com.
I'll put that in the show notes. Yeah, I mean, as a civics teacher, I want people to be more active in local elections. This is a local election thing. So do you guys have it'd be really cool to have a list, because people might be like a one topic, one issue voter. And this might be like the issue. Like, it'd be really cool to have, like, in your state, here are the candidates that support school choice or something like that. Would be really cool. So people can just look up and find out if that's like something. So when they make these local election calls, that would be really nice. Corey, thank you so much for coming on here. Just like a wealth of information and knowledge on this topic. And I appreciate it, because I'm going to be going in this direction, as I said. So I'm very interested in supporting this. And again, it's not just for me. It's for me. Yeah, but it's not just for me. It's for every good teacher out there that's like, where can I go? Why am I here? And this teacher right here that's just like movie day again and just gives a worksheet from online. Well, I'm hustling and bustling, like I'm doing my thing. Like, why are we getting paid the same? Why are we treated the same? Like, I like this free market for my educator friends out there as well. Like, you can go somewhere that you can really do your craft and be appreciated for it and paid for it and everything like that. That seems ideal for educators as well. You kind of checked all the boxes that you'd be looking for a good educational system, and changing it. So I'm stoked about the way the future is looking, man. Thank you so much for coming on here and sharing all the stuff you have.
Yeah, thank you so much, Will. It's good talking to you.
Yeah, it's good to talk to you too. All right. Thanks, guys. Thank you for listening. Hey there, Cylinder Radio listeners. If you like the approach that I take on the podcast and social media and want to try and implement some of the strategies that I use to have productive conversations on challenging topics, check out my free downloadable guide, Debate to Dialogue. It's available on my website, williamroosh.com/debate to dialogue.